I wanted to talk about Egypt and what's happening in Egypt, but I just want to say one word about the issue of lawfare, which is using the terminology of law in order to conduct political warfare against states, because Israel is the first victim in this, and it has been. In fact, the additional protocols of the Geneva Convention from 1977 that Doug was talking about were directly a consequence of the Zionism as racism UN General Assembly resolution in 1975, and it was particularly specifically in order to assist the PLO in its terrorist and political war against Israel. So I think that it's important, and Israeli scholars from that time and since have said that this starts with Israel, but that the United States and other countries that take their sovereignty seriously, like India, for instance, and Kashmir and other places, are also directly impacted by this. So I think that what Doug was talking about really bears that out, and I think that when we look at the lawfare that's going on against Israel with things like the Goldstone report that Goldstone himself just repudiated and other things, that it's very important to fight political fire with political fire and not go running to the Constitution or anything else in order to fight what is essentially a political fight. Now, having said that, I do want to just take one step backward and go to Egypt, because I think that this is a subject that that what we have seen in Egypt since January is really an earthquake from a strategic perspective, from everybody in the region, and from an Israeli perspective, again, first, because we're on the front line and we are looking at 80 million Egyptians, 2 million of whom stood in Tahrir Square with Yusuf Qaradawi and followed him when he said that they are marching on Jerusalem. And the ground shook in Jerusalem, I know, because I was sitting in my home there. And I think it's very important for us to just understand what has happened in Egypt and what the ramifications are for both Israeli policy and for American policy. So in late December, as a result of what had happened in Tunisia, we had what was portrayed in the American press and the Western press in general as the Facebook revolution in Egypt, where, as Congressman West said, you had a bunch of very photogenic, fluent English speakers, young women with a lot of makeup and very few hijabs, standing in front of CNN cameras and talking about how much they want freedom. And everybody said, oh, rah, rah, rah. And next thing you know, Obama was standing before the television cameras telling the United States' most important Arab ally to leave, and he did. And now he and his sons are under arrest and in all likelihood will be tried for whatever and hung in Tahrir Square at some point, much to the cheering of the photogenic people who will be carted out in front of the CNN cameras to say what a wonderful thing just happened. I think it was very interesting to see the disconnect between the Israeli commentary on what was happening in Egypt and the American commentary about what was happening in Egypt, because unfortunately it appears that the Israelis have a much more sober-minded view of what popular rule means in Egypt than Americans have. Because unlike what we were being shown on the television cameras, what we are getting is not liberal democracy in Egypt. We are getting populism in Egypt. And when you say populism from an Egyptian perspective, populism in Egypt essentially means two things. It means Islam or three things: Islam, poverty, and anti-Semitism. And along with that, anti-Americanism. So that Egypt was definitely a tyranny under Hosni Mubarak, but Hosni Mubarak, because he was fighting at least one of those things, which was Islam, in his war against the Muslim Brotherhood, he had a perception of shared interests with Israel against the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas, which is a Muslim Brotherhood organization that rules Gaza, and against Al-Qaeda, which is, of course, a spin-off of the Muslim Brotherhood through the Islamic Jihad of Egypt. And so he was, and also in his perception of the rising menace from Iran. So on three very important strategic issues, Hosni Mubarak, with warts and all, had very important perceived shared interests with Israel and with the United States. No successor to his regime has that same perception of interests. And as a consequence, we can assume that no one will feel obligated by the obligations that Mubarak, as a dictator, took onto himself to advance those perceived shared interests, which in his view were first and foremost the interests of his regime, of himself. So we have right now essentially two forces in Egypt that are rising as a result of the overthrow of Mubarak. The first one is the Muslim Brotherhood, as Congressman West suggested, because again, you know, when you're talking about Egypt or Arab societies in general, you find that there is only one organization on the ground in any of these societies that is not the regime that is organized, and that is the Muslim Brotherhood. It's true in Tunisia as well, by the way. Everybody talks about Tunisia as a secular country, but again, the only organized political group in Tunisia, as in Egypt, aside from the ruling tyranny, is the Muslim Brotherhood. And the other, and we already saw 78% of Egyptians supported constitutional amendments that essentially paved the way for Muslim Brotherhood takeover of the country in the September elections. The other one that we have, the other group that we have of rising political forces in Egypt is the mob. The mob are the young people who, by the way, brought about the 1952 officers' revolution in Egypt. The mob are the young people who refuse to leave Tahrir Square now that the military junta running Egypt has asked them to every single day, and they don't, and they continue to riot there, and they're the ones who are demanding Mubarak's head on a plate. And both of these forces are radically anti-American, radically anti-Semitic, and they don't have problems either collaborating with one another in their joint wars. Another misconception of the Americans, and by the way of the Israelis who simply don't want to cope with reality to a large degree, is this idea that it's okay because the military is a secular institution. Again, the same secular military, 2 points about it. They just arrested and imprisoned their commander-in-chief, Hosni Mubarak. What does that tell you about the nature of the Egyptian military and who they're listening to? The other thing that we should simply remember is that the assassin of Anwar Sadat was a military officer, and that the main place, or the place that the Islamic Jihad in Egypt was strongest, was the military. And it remains so today, so that the idea that because you're a Nasserist, you're not an Islamist is not true, and we see that very clearly also in the persona of Amr Moussa, who is going to be the next president of Egypt. Amr Moussa is a Nasserist. A Nasserist is essentially an Arab Nazi. The ideology of Nasser is Nazi ideology towards Jews and towards America and towards human freedom, and they do not have a problem with collaborating actively with Islamists to achieve their goals, which are annihilationist. And so he doesn't wear a jalabiyah, he wears a suit. And he will tell the CNN cameras, again, of course we're going to respect our peace treaty with Israel. But he will not. And we saw that even with Mohammed el-Baradei, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, who said that if Israel takes action against the Muslim Brotherhood, that is Hamas, in Gaza, that Egypt should declare war against the Zionists. He said this last week. So this is what we're looking at. Now, what does all of this mean from an Israeli perspective, aside from run for the hills, and from an American perspective? Because, of course, we can't run to the hills because Obama, of course, wants us to give those to the PLO. But there are several things. Well, there's one thing essentially that Israel has to do, which is we have to increase the size of our army. We have to massively increase our military budgets. We have to stop with the exemptions for the seminary students, and we're going to need another 2 divisions because essentially for the past 30 years our southern front has been Gaza, and now our southern front is back to being Egypt. And so we're going to have to prepare for war if we want to have any type of peace. And we're also looking at a problematic military situation. This is one thing that I did want to mention, which is that, you know, everybody's saying, well, they haven't abrogated the peace treaty. They haven't abrogated the peace treaty. Well, let's just look for 1 second at what they've done, because it's important to bear it in mind. For the first time in 30 years, Egypt allowed 2 Iranian naval craft to traverse the Suez Canal and they went to Syria, to Latakia port, which is now on fire, happily, because people are rebelling against Assad. But they went to Latakia port, and one of those naval craft that was not inspected by the Egyptians, and that the Egyptians refused to allow either American naval craft or Israeli naval craft to inspect in accordance with international law under binding UN Security Council Chapter 7 sanctions. They did not inspect them. Those Iranian ships went to Latakia. One of them contained advanced weaponry for Hamas. It was transferred to a Turkish, German-registered cruise liner that went on to a Turkish port, and Israeli naval commandos boarded that Turkish vessel, or vessel from Turkey, in international waters just last month. That was one thing that they did. The other thing that they did is that they have stopped the military closure between the Sinai and Gaza, so that, now everybody's talking about the new flotilla from Turkey, which is horrible, but we have to understand that now Hamas controls an international border with Egypt, and Egypt is collaborating with Hamas in the transfer of weaponry. So Israel has to increase the size of our military. We have to increase the size of our military budgets. Luckily for us, we just found massive reservoirs of natural gas that are supposed to enable us to become a net energy exporter within 3 years. So hopefully that will be able to take some of the crunch out of our constrained economic needs. The other thing is from the United States' perspective. First of all, the first thing that I can tell you as somebody coming in from Israel is wake up. Wake up. Wake up. This is a really, really bad thing. And in fact, if you want to compare what just happened to Egypt to historical precedents, I would argue that this is worse than the 1979 revolution in Iran. This is the United States' most important Arab ally, and they are moving very, very quickly into the enemy column. And this is a very big problem. The other thing that the United States has to do is, as Congressman West was saying, was use the power of hearings in Congress to start having discussions about this, to try to start pushing the envelope on this, talking about it, getting the news out so that people can recognize it, because as quickly as possible, it would be terrific if the United States could stop funding the Egyptian military. And the last thing that we have to recognize is that when you're dealing with something like this, whether the former ally is Turkey or Egypt, that you really have to think about developing a policy of multipolar containment. The American strategy for the Persian Gulf in the 1980s was a policy of dual containment towards Iran and Iraq. At this point, I believe that the United States is going to have to develop a policy of multipolar containment, and this brings me to my last point, which is that I think that all of this shows very clearly just what a vital ally Israel is to the United States. It's not simply a friend. It's not simply a country that shares values. It is the only country in the Middle East that the United States can trust under all circumstances, that is not going to have a revolution, because we are a democracy, and democracies know how to change peacefully, something that tyrannies cannot do. And I think this just makes very clear how essential a strong Israel is, and why I'm so happy that we have our good friends in charge of the House of Representatives today and watching our back. So thank you very much. I can take some questions.
I'm sure we have a lot of questions. On the right, can you let us know your name and organization?